I believe that the full story of what happened to Luten is that he and his men managed to break through the outer wall and force General Sung to surrender. Luten and Iroh met up one last time. Iroh collected the knife from General Sung and retired back to his leadership position. Luten refused to go with Iroh and kept pushing on soon after with his men, and was directly targeted along with his squad by General Hao, who took over command in General Sung's absence. As for what General Hao did, I imagine that him and his men simply caused a massive avalanche out of the debris the Fire Army created and crushed them all to death with it. Iroh heard the news and called a tactical retreat, abandoning the walled city in tears. To his great dismay, Luten and his squad were forgotten to history, their achievements attributed directly to the Dragon of the West.
I know! You could bring my mother back!
What if Kaya never died? Chief Hakoda was changed by the death of his wife, and thus changed the Southern Water Tribe's response to the war. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that, like their northern brethren, the Southern Water Tribe's war tactics were based around defense as opposed to offense. If Kaya survived, Hakoda and the other men would continue those strategies. In terms of Sokka and Katara, they would grow up their entire lives surrounded by the ice and snow in the Southern Water Tribe. The men of the village would fill the roles that they struggled to in the show, including gathering food. Since Katara and Sokka never venture out alone amongst the iceberg, the chain of events that led to them discovering Aang can never happen. They would both just live normal teen lives in the Southern Water Tribe, with both of their parents. And Katara's waterbending would most likely remain at novice level. If Sokka and Katara avoid the chain of events under which they found Aang in the series, then Aang would remain in suspended animation near the Southern Water Tribe. The Avatar cycle would be virtually broken, and the next Avatar could never be born, as the Avatar spirit, Rava, would be eternally trapped within Aang. Since the Avatar would have never returned to the world, Prince Zuko would be stuck searching for Aang in banishment for the rest of his life. The tide of the war would remain firmly in the hands of the Fire Nation, as there is no Avatar to help and inspire people around the world. The Fire Lord would simply wait until the end of summer, harness the power of the comet, as his grandfather Sozin had, and use it to wipe out Ba Sing Se and the rest of the Earth Kingdom. Extra consequences. The Kyoshi warriors would never leave Kyoshi Island to help with the war effort because Team Avatar would never have inspired them. They may possibly be destroyed during the comet. Jet would have eventually succeeded in destroying the Fire Village, either through luck of filling up the reservoir or some other means. Him and the Freedom Fighters would still be around and would never be redeemed or see the error in their ways. They may possibly be destroyed during the comet. The comet attack on Ba Sing Se would have come as a surprise, with millions of casualties, including possibly Earth King Kui himself. Long Feng and the Dai Li would most likely survive, however, due to prior knowledge of the war. The Mechanist would continue to make weapons for the Fire Nation. Him and his people may also be destroyed during the comet. Toph would continue her life as an aristocrat, hiding her amazing abilities from her parents. Also, no metal bending. She may also be killed by Sozin's comet. Mei stays in New Ozai and Ty Lee stays in the circus. Zuko never finds his mother. The eclipse passes with no military developments. Hama continues to imprison people in the mountains until she dies of old age. She has no heir, her victims starve to death, and this whole thing becomes an unsolved Fire Nation mystery. The Boiling Rock's prison record remains inescapable. The Cabbage Man establishes a monopoly on cabbages and ascends to the aristocracy in Ba Sing Se before the comet arrives. The Ember Island players adapt this version of the story and pay me 5% royalties. Azula would remain in the Fire Nation and possibly become Fire Lord during the comet. The White Lotus would never come out of hiding and would possibly suffer many casualties as a result of the comet. Iroh would travel with Zuko for many years before dying of old age. The Moon Spirit would never have been killed, and thus Yue would never become the Moon. She marries Han and is miserable. Potentially, this difference in the family tree could cause Korra's family line to be different / never come to prominence. Aunt Wu's volcano prediction would still come true, as she would predict that the volcano would erupt because Aang wouldn't have arrived to stop it. The whole village evacuates safely. Momo remains alone at the Southern Air Temple. Master Pakku and Kana never get married. The hippies still make it to Amashu though. And that's been What If Kaya Never Died. Yeah, there was a pretty negative outcome there. I hope that the reasons I listed was enough for you guys, but if they weren't, please comment down below.
Hello, Zuko here.
Zuko's choice to betray Uncle Iroh and join Azula in Ba Sing Se was one of the worst decisions of his life. Luckily, he was able to turn it around and make the best decision of his life and join Team Avatar. But what if he never turned things around? What if Zuko never joined Team Avatar? If Zuko never joined Team Avatar, he would remain in the Fire Nation as the heroic prince that slew the Avatar. At least up until the invasion. Once it becomes clear to Ozai that Zuko didn't kill the Avatar, he would either be banished again, permanently, or outright executed. I'm going with permanent banishment for the sake of entertainment. Because he has nothing left to lose at this point, instead of following Team Avatar, Zuko tries to find Iroh and join up with him. Since Zuko's conversation with Ozai was much more brief than in the show, he manages to catch up with Iroh just as he is breaking out of prison. He lends a hand, and they are both able to successfully evade capture and escape the Fire Nation. Once they are far away from the Fire Nation, Zuko asks Iroh what now, and Iroh replies that it's time for them to meet up with some old friends of his. Zuko joins the White Lotus, along with Iroh, and they prepare to protect Ba Sing Se from the oncoming comet-assisted genocide. Because Team Avatar is out of the loop when it comes to Ozai's secret genocide plan, Aang decides to wait until after Sozin's comet to fight the Fire Lord. The comet arrives, and with it, Ozai and his fleet. Without Team Avatar there to confront them, Ozai and the fleet manage to murder thousands and destroy a significant amount of the Earth Kingdom. It seems that the Fire Nation's victory is assured, and they have but one target left, Ba Sing Se. I will end part 1 of the What If here, but that doesn't mean that we are finished. Without Zuko, there are plenty of other differences, and I will cover some of them shortly. But before that, I ask that you like, comment, and subscribe to keep me and the channel going. Now back to the video. If Zuko never joined Team Avatar, there's virtually no way that Aang can learn firebending because every other firebender would be aligned with the Fire Lord, and the gang had no idea where Zhong Zhong was. Without firebending, Aang would be at a serious disadvantage in a fight against Ozai, especially during the comet. Without Zuko's help, Sokka could never have rescued Hakoda and Suki from the boiling rock. Also, if Zuko never joined the group, Katara would have never gained proper closure about her mother's death, and would be less complete as a person. Also, no Zutara shipping. Furthermore, with Azula, Mei, and Ty Lee, because Sokka and Zuko never broke into the boiling rock, Azula, Mei, and Ty Lee would all remain friends because Mei wouldn't turn against Azula to save Zuko. Because of this, Azula would never start to lose her mind and would be a much more serious threat. Alright guys, that's been What If Zuko Never Joined Team Avatar Part 1. If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe.
It's easy to do nothing, but it's hard to forgive.
Forgiveness can be a tricky endeavor. Most of us probably only forgive loved ones or close friends. But to forgive the nation that mercilessly slaughtered your people, I think.
That's Avatar stuff. That doesn't count.
So why did Aang forgive the Fire Nation? The ability to forgive is a pretty good sign of a self-actualized person. Self-actualization is a long, arduous mental and physical process that makes someone the best they can possibly be. Seems Aang has that box thoroughly checked. Near the end of Book 2, Aang goes off to master the Avatar state with the Guru, Patik. Up until that point, the Avatar state was unstable and uncomfortable for Aang. He had no ability to control it, and that, coupled with the heavy destructive capabilities of the state, deeply disturbed him. It's during this training that Aang takes his first steps towards not only mastering the Avatar state, but mastering himself. To master the Avatar state, one must first open all 7 chakras: the earth, water, fire, air, sound, light, and thought chakra. For the purposes of this video, we will focus on the air chakra, or the heart chakra. Guru Patik states that this chakra deals in love, but is blocked by grief. In Aang's case, his energy, his love, was connected to his spiritual brethren, the air nomads. When the Fire Nation began their genocide of the Airbenders, they managed to wipe the entire culture from the face of the earth. As is the namesake of the show, Aang is indeed the last Airbender, and the pain and the grief attached to that is bottomless. We see numerous occasions throughout the show where this loss deeply affects Aang. Sadness, anger, and fear surround Aang in his daily life, but now he has the chance to relinquish it. Aang meditates into a surreal vision, seeing all of the air nomads before him. He smiles, happy to see them all together again, happy to be a part of his cultural collective again. However, these feelings are short-lived, as one by one the air nomads disappear into a puff of smoke, a symbolic representation of their lost lives. At first, there's despair and great anguish. The moment has passed and the gravity of the situation comes crashing down. But Guru Patik has the answers for this suffering. He urges Aang not to despair. The loss he has suffered is immense, but the sentiment has never left Aang.
The air nomad's love for you has not left this world. It is still inside of your heart.
This line is crucial to Aang's growth into a fully realized avatar and person. It is the recognition that not all was lost with the Fire Nation's brutal genocidal attack. There is a part of the air nomads that is untouchable within Aang's heart. Patik's next lesson is similarly transcendent.
And is reborn in the form of new love.
Korra, the Avatar's new love. This is the moment Aang fully realizes his feelings for her. They are not a simple childhood crush. Aang admits to himself and to the Guru that he does in fact love Katara. It is a destined love. Katara has become the living manifestation of the love the air nomads had for Aang. It is with both these revelations that I believe Aang comes to terms with the loss of his people and realizes his present responsibility to a new world and a new love. As established before, Aang was able to relinquish his grief and move on in pursuit of love and responsibility. Obviously, the gang and him endured many challenges and hardships throughout Book 2 and 3, but none was as impactful as the Ozai debacle. Fire Lord Ozai is an insidious, genocidal psychopath with no redeeming qualities, but Aang, having self-actualized and drawing on the wisdom of the air nomads, refuses to kill him. Even former avatars believe that Ozai should die, but Aang holds to his beliefs. During the final fight, Aang has several moments where he could have dealt a decisive, killing blow on Ozai, and yet He's steadfast in preserving his life. After push comes to shove, and the Avatar state triggers, Aang overcomes the fury of the former Avatars to spare Ozai's life. Now Ozai is the culmination of everything that has caused Aang, the air nomads, and the world at large suffering a century long. He openly mocks Aang for not having the spine to finish him off. The mocking turns to attack, but Aang simply dodges, disarms, and disables Ozai, removing his firebending. By doing this, Aang is setting a new precedent for the world, replacing the bitterness, hatred, and war set by Sozin and his successors with one of peace, mercy, and forgiveness.
It's easy to do nothing, but it's hard to forgive.
Hello everyone, my name is Avatar Ken, and this is why I think the Fire Nation invasion was doomed from the start. Alright, so first I'll start off with a brief summary of what the invasion was. In Season 2, Team Avatar went to the secret library, and in the secret library, they found out that a solar eclipse was happening, and during a solar eclipse, firebenders would lose their bending and would not be able to fight back, right? They planned to invade the Fire Nation on the Day of Black Sun to get, like, the element of surprise over the Fire Nation and win the war, right? It was a pretty good plan, and even though the Earth Kingdom ended up falling, they still went ahead and kept planning for the plan. And, you know, the mid-season sort of finale of Book 3 is them invading the Fire Nation on that day. However, if you remember, Azula figured out about the plan and warned the Fire Nation, and that's the reason why the plan ultimately failed, right? I think a lot of us never quite think about if this plan was ever really gonna work on its own. Like, if the Fire Nation had absolutely not known, I honestly don't think that it would have went as good as they think. And here's why. First of all, they had no army, right? The original plan for invading the Fire Nation actually involved the entire army of the Earth Kingdom from Ba Sing Se, right? That would have been a pretty good force to get in there, right? But obviously after Ba Sing Se failed, they couldn't use the army anymore. So Sokka's backup plan was, hey, I'll just use like warriors from the Southern Water Tribe, and we'll use a couple people that we ran into while we were, you know, traveling around the world who were really powerful warriors or benders, right? And, you know, like, there are really good benders. Like, you got the Rock, the Boulder, you got, you know, like Haru, like, you got the Swamp Benders, and then you have other powerful non-benders as well as like the technological genius of the Mechanists. So that was like a force to be reckoned with. I'm not going to say that it wasn't, but honestly, I feel like without using like proper soldiers, even the advanced technology that they were going to use probably would have gotten them to the Fire Nation. But I just do not think that it would have been as sufficient as having like a well-trained army, right? So I think that's one big strike against the plan that no one really thinks about. Secondly, right, there would have been some pretty bad casualties if this had happened. Like, even if there was a surprise attack, if you remember during like the one that happened for real, the Fire Nation knew that they were coming. So the soldiers were only really told to make it look like they were fighting back, right? They really weren't. And you can see that in the episode, right? And they even notice it, you know, before they get too far, that it was a trap and that they all knew, right? But even if this would happen and it was a surprise attack for real, everyone's gonna fight back full force before the eclipse happens, right? So you're gonna take like heavier casualties that way. You might actually end up losing some people along the way that they didn't lose obviously in the show, and that could have weakened morale, you know? So that's the second reason why I think they might not have went the way we think. The third reason is probably like the most important reason, and it's basically that Aang was not ready to fight Ozai, right? If Aang were to fight Ozai at that time, he would have lost for sure. And there's several reasons for this. His firebending and his earthbending just aren't up to snuff yet. And this is after that point where they had already tried to invade the Fire Nation.
I'm not ready. I need more time to master firebending.
And frankly, your earthbending could still use some work too.
So we're talking about an Aang whose earthbending is much weaker than it probably was by that point. And we're also talking about an Aang who can barely firebend at all. He still hasn't gotten over the mental block, right? Also, here's another thing. If you remember, this Aang has his chakra blocked by the damage to his body that Azula did during the Ba Sing Se fight. So not only is he have two elements that are partially handicapped, if not just straight up not usable, he also cannot use the Avatar state, right? So we're talking about an Aang who only has 3 elements, and only 2 of those is he really master level at, fighting an Ozai who's a master level firebender. And here's the biggest kicker that I don't think anyone thinks about. If Ozai shoots lightning at Aang, he's done. Because at this point, Zuko had not taught Aang how to redirect lightning. If Ozai can connect Aang with the lightning, which he most likely can because he's the fastest and most powerful lightning bender we see up until that point. If he gets Aang point blank with one of those lightning blasts, Aang is done. There's nothing he can do. So I think that's another really big reason why the invasion might not have gone too great. And the last reason that I want to talk about is also another very important reason. It's basically the politics of the matter, right? Essentially what would have happened is you would have Team Avatar and the invasion force taking out Ozai. Let's say that in some miracle he does defeat Ozai, right? You're removing the head of state from a nation that is currently at war with the rest of the world. I'm not sure if they really thought this through, but I don't think there's any scenario where Aang would kill Ozai. And if Aang doesn't kill Ozai, then he's still going to be dangerous, obviously. And there's no way that Aang can take away his bending at that point. So you still have Ozai alive. Ozai still has political sway, right? And even if someone else tries to kill Ozai, I just don't think this situation is going to end up very great, because you're going to have a lot of resentment, and you're going to have a lot of political things going on that might end up either keeping the war going or even sparking a new war, right? Or even maybe a couple civil wars within the Fire Nation. The situation would not end in the peace we see at the end of this show.
It would be the wrong way to end the war. History would see it as just more senseless violence. The only way for this war to end peacefully is for the Avatar to defeat the Fire Lord. Someone new must take the throne. It has to be you, Prince Zuko.
So basically, guys, this was just my own opinion. You don't have to take this as word of God, but I really don't think that the invasion plan would have worked. That's all I had to say. I hope you guys liked this video, and if you did, please support my other videos. And yeah, Avatar Ken out. Aang gets in some pretty good licks, but he is ultimately captured, so I'm counting this as a loss. Yeah, I'm counting everything that Aang does on this ship as a win. This includes him fighting with the guards, his fight against Zuko, and also him deflecting the fire blast at the end. So this is a definite win. Technically, with the Kyoshi warriors, this was a sneak attack, but Aang was still captured and ambushed, so I'm counting this as a loss. I don't consider the Yanagi to be a combatant, and Aang was not really trying to fight it, so I don't count this as a fight. Man, Zuko really cannot catch a break whenever he's fighting Aang, especially in book 1, so this is definitely a win. Now, Aang versus Bumi is a very interesting case. They did technically fight to a draw, and Bumi did technically give up and or concede the fight. So I'm counting this as a victory. Aang did technically aid in the fight against the Fire Nation by giving them the coal, and he did do a cool air machine gun thing. So I will count this since he was technically on the winning side and he was participating in the battle. Alright, so Aang gets absolutely ragdolled by Heibai, and he ends up losing Sokka, so this is a definite loss. Alright, so with Heibai round 2, I'm gonna give Aang the win, and this is why. Aang did successfully pacify Heibai, and he did successfully save the village and get Sokka back, so I'm counting that as a win because he achieved his goals, even though he didn't really fight. So with the Fire Nation blockade, Aang does successfully dodge and or intercept all of the flaming projectiles, and they all make it into the Fire Nation, so this is a definite win for Aang. Okay, so the ordeal with the Fire Sages is an interesting case, but Aang did technically elude their capture and did elude when Zuko captured him in the end, and he also made it to Roku, which was his only goal, so I will technically count this as a win. And yeah, this is technically Avatar Roku performing all of these actions right here, so I cannot count this as a win for Aang. So with the fight with the pirates, initially, Aang and the gang do get away, so I'm counting that as an Aang win. With the pirate capture in the woods, yeah, this is a really brief skirmish, but Aang and Sokka are promptly captured by the pirates, so this is a definite loss. Aang also manages to escape from Zuko and the rest of the pirates once again, so that's another win. Even though it wasn't just Aang and the gang fighting this camp of Fire Nation soldiers, Jet and them ended up prevailing in the end, so I'm counting this as an Aang victory. With the Jet versus Aang fight, it is clear that Aang is definitely holding back a little bit with Jet, but he ultimately does fail to stop Jet, so I'm counting this as an Aang loss. Now I know I said I wouldn't count any grunts, but technically the canyon crawlers are the main antagonists of the episode if you don't count the annoying tribespeople, and Aang ends up besting them, so I'm counting this as an Aang win. So in the beginning of the Blue Spirit, Aang does get captured pretty handily by the Yuyan archers, so that is a definite Aang loss. Later on in the episode, after Zuko, the Blue Spirit, frees Aang, him and the Blue Spirit do manage to get outside of the stronghold, so I'm counting this as another win for Aang. As a side note, at the end of the Blue Spirit, Zuko does technically firebend at Aang, but I don't count this because Aang had no objective here with Zuko, and he gets away. Also, similar to the Unagi, I will not be counting Aang stopping the volcano as a win, as he is not technically fighting a living thing, so that I'm not counting that. Aang versus Zuko in this episode is extremely underrated, and this is an underrated episode in general in my opinion. But Aang and Zuko's fight was very even, but eventually Aang did end up defeating Zuko, and he got Katara's necklace back, so I'm counting that as a win for Aang. Aang versus Zhao will be the first example of something I will refer to as a mental win, because technically Aang never throws a single blow at Zhao, but he did manage to get Zhao to stop fighting, because Zhao basically defeated himself. So I'm giving Aang the W on this one too. The Northern Air Temple battle is a no-brainer. Aang gets the W for this because he took out many soldiers and he was on the winning side, so W for Aang. So the book 1 finale was extremely tricky, but this is what I ultimately came to. Aang doesn't have any fights in the waterbending masters, so I can't really count anything he does there. Also, I will not count him taking out any of those ships in the Fire Navy fleet because he hardly put a dent in the overall fleet. And then when Aang is transformed into Koizilla, I also can't count that because he isn't technically in control of himself. Also, there's another weird thing where technically Aang does get captured by Zuko, but it's not his fault. That's actually Katara's fault. But he does wake up and he does technically fail to get away from Zuko, but that encounter was interrupted by Katara, so I can't count that either. The one thing that I will count is when Aang is in the spirit spirit world, he has sort of like a mental battle with Ko the Space Stealer, and he does not lose his faith, and he does contribute to the war effort, so he's getting a win because the Northern Water Tribe did technically survive the battle. There were a total of 22 fights that were eligible for review according to my rules. Aang won 16 of them and lost 6 of them, giving him a win percentage of roughly 73% and 27% respectively for Book 1 of Avatar. So this time around, I've actually updated the rules. The old rules still apply, but there will be draws this time, and something I refer to as a mental win and mental loss. Basically what I mean here is any situation in which there is no physical fight, but there's a very poignant mental one. If you disagree with the inclusion of these, that's fine. I've actually filtered them out at the end of the video, but with that being said, let's get into it. Aang avoids every attack and refuses to fight back against General Fong. To add to that, not only does General Fong capture and trap Katara, but he also gets Aang to go into the Avatar state, which is what he wanted and what he was trying to force out of Aang. So with some careful consideration, I think I'm actually gonna count this as a loss for Aang.
What did I just do?
I'm giving Aang the loss in this episode by a technicality. Aang and the gang's entire goal is to get to Omashu, which the Fire Nation army successfully negates by shooting projectiles and sealing the group in the cave. If you think I'm being too critical, just remember that last season the gang encountered a similar situation, yet they made it out of there alright.
What did I just do?
Aang and Mei do have a tiny skirmish, but it gets interfered with, so even though I think Aang would have won, I'm counting this as a draw. Aang's main goal here was to free Bumi, which he did, but his fight with Azula was interfered with by Bumi, so I'm gonna count this as another draw. A strange spiritual tornado does technically force Aang and the gang to land in a swamp against their will, but I don't count nature, so on to the Hugh fight. Initially, Hugh is successful in splitting up the group, but I'm going to count this entire encounter as one solid fight. So when he later attacks the group, he does put up one hell of a fight, but it's Aang himself who defeats him, so this is an Aang win.
Thanks, positive attitude.
After learning about Appa and Momo's capture, Aang and Katara deliver a pretty devastating strike against the other swamp benders, but don't defeat them. They eventually make peace, so I'm counting this as a draw. So at the beginning of this episode, Team Avatar is ambushed, but they do manage to escape the Rough Rhinos. However, there is a real fight with the Rough Rhinos at the end of the episode, which Aang handily wins, netting him another win.
Thanks, positive attitude.
I feel really bad for Toph because there's no way she could have prepared for the Avatar to show up in the ring, but Aang does dodge all of her attacks and knocks her out of the ring, so this is an Aang win.
Thanks, positive attitude.
Right after explaining how OP her bending is, Toph and Aang still manage to be kidnapped by the wrestlers, so this is a loss.
What did I just do?
I might get hate for including this as a fight, but Aang totally dropped his guard against Toph, and she made sure to get her lick back for the airbending shenanigans Aang pulled earlier, so this is a loss for Aang.
What did I just do?
The chase was an extremely difficult episode to decipher, but this is my interpretation. Although the first half of the episode contains no real fighting, just Azula chasing down the gang, her constant pursuit of the group causes them some pretty serious issues, such as sleep deprivation and internal peace. However, at no point was the gang actually defeated. Later in the episode, however, Azula does defeat Aang one-on-one, with him having to be saved by Katara and the rest of the group. So Azula versus Aang in this episode is a loss for Aang.
What did I just do?
Now, Aang is a part of the fight against Azula at the end, but Azula ended up escaping that class, so I'll count that in the rest of the episode as a draw for Aang and the others. Aang's dilemma in this episode is something I'll refer to as a mental battle. Aang battles his own philosophies as an airbender while trying to overcome Toph's earthbender philosophies. Toph full well uses this weakness against him to try to elicit the right approach out of him, and while he fails to get it the first few times, eventually Aang does stand up to Toph and learn how to earthbend, so I'm counting this entire episode as a fight and a mental win for Aang.
Thanks, positive attitude.
While Sokka is the one to land a decisive blow on Wan Shi Tong and achieve their goal of getting intel on the Fire Nation, Aang is instrumental to this as he protected Sokka while he gathered the intel, and he is the reason they were able to safely escape, so I'm counting this as a win for Aang.
Thanks, positive attitude.
There is a fight in this episode against Buzzard Wasp in which Aang prevents Momo from being captured, so that is a win. But ultimately, Aang fails to keep his cool throughout the entire episode, causing him to lash out and not make the group's horrible conditions any better. So I'm going to count that as a mental loss for Aang. Aang and Katara piece up the serpent and get everyone across the serpent's pass, so that's a win.
Thanks, positive attitude.
Aang does manage to overcome his struggle with Appa's loss, so I'm giving him another mental win.
Thanks, positive attitude.
This is a pretty simple one. Team Avatar infiltrate and discover how to destroy the drill. Azula and friends attack, but Aang fights Azula evenly for most of the fight before it's interrupted by the drill slurry. You could say that Azula had Aang on the ropes at one point, but he quickly rebounded and he struck the drill so hard and flung Azula so far that she realistically should have died. But anyway, the drill was destroyed and Azula was stopped, so this is an Aang win.
Thanks, positive attitude.
Long Feng and the Dai Li prove in this episode that they are a force to be reckoned with, as they so casually prevent Team Avatar from talking to the Earth King and successfully blackmail them into docility.
What did I just do?
There's a ton of on and off fighting in this episode, but Team Avatar ultimately manages to clutch out the win in the end with the help of Appa, so this is an Aang W.
Thanks, positive attitude.
Don't think I forgot about this little scrap though. It's very one-sided, but Aang does successfully talk Jet out of his brainwashing, so this is an Aang win.
Thanks, positive attitude.
Team Avatar managed to defeat all the Earth King's guards and convince him that Long Feng is corrupt, so this is an Aang win.
Thanks, positive attitude.
This one is going to require a ton of explaining. So Aang does successfully open most of his chakras, except for the last one, as it would require him to let go of Katara. He almost did open the last one, but he closed it after seeing a vision of Katara in trouble. Now, even though Guru Patik says that Aang will ruin his training if he doesn't stay and completely unlock his last chakra, he is actually mistaken, as later on in the finale of Book 2, Aang is able to open all of his chakras after letting go of Katara in the moment. As a further note, later in the series, Aang believes that he blocked his chakra, but this is proven false during the fight against Ozai, as what Aang thought was a blocked chakra was only really a physical injury caused by Azula's lightning, hence the pointy rock restoring his connection to the Avatar state. I know that all sounds confusing, and it really is. The writing on Avatar is not at all perfect, especially when it comes to all of this stuff. But anyway, since Aang did technically fully complete the training, I'm giving him the win.
Thanks, positive attitude.
Aang fights Zuko before he switches to Azula, and neither one of them really bests the other, so I'm calling this a draw. Aang does way worse against Azula than he did with Zuko, and while this fight was interrupted by the Dai Li, later when Aang goes into the Avatar state, it is Azula who deals the literal killing blow to Aang, so this is an Aang loss.
What did I just do?
Now, I might get some hate for counting this, but Aang's entire goal of the series is to stop the Fire Nation. And technically, when Ba Sing Se was defeated by the Fire Nation pretty much won the war. So I'm counting this as perhaps the biggest Aang loss in the entire series.
The Earth Kingdom has fallen.
According to my rules, there were a total of 27 fights this season of Avatar. Of the 27 fights, Aang won 13 fights, lost 9 fights, and had 5 draws. However, some of Aang's wins and losses were mental, such as in Bitter Work, the Desert, the Serpent's Pass, the Guru, etc. Again, I believe that the mental part of a battle is just as poignant as the physical, but if you disagree, then Aang's win-loss and draw ratio looks slightly different, with 8 wins, 7 losses, and 5 draws. And today, we'll be tackling Book 3 on my series of Aang's win and loss ratio in Avatar: The Last Airbender. My rules have already been pretty much set in stone, except for a mental draw. Other than that, we can hop right into the video. Aang is going through perhaps the worst time in his life in this episode. He has a very critical mental war within himself as he struggles with the notion that he failed in Ba Sing Se and the world thinks that he's dead. For most of the episode, Aang is on the verge of losing the mental battle within himself, and at one point, he has a near-death encounter because of it. Ultimately, his friends find him and he overcomes the anguish of this defeat in Ba Sing Se, so I'm gonna give Aang the mental win here. While there's not really any fighting in this episode, Aang successfully navigates a Fire Nation school, stands up to a bully, and in the end has a genuine effect on the spirit of the Fire Nation youth by teaching them to express themselves through dancing. Also, a little one-on-one dance with Katara certainly helps. This is another mental win for Aang. This may be a stretch, and the Painted Lady is probably my least favorite episode, but Aang did help Katara liberate the fishing village from the Fire Nation, so I'll give him a win too. Aang versus Combustion Man ends with Aang essentially running away, but he did put up a damn good fight, so I'm gonna give him a draw in this instance.
Wake up, sleepyhead.
This episode ends in another draw against Combustion Man.
Wake up, sleepyhead.
Bloodbending is so incredibly overpowered that as soon as Hama uses the technique on Aang and Sokka, they instantly lost the fight and were literally being used as sadistic puppets to attack Katara and each other. This is Aang's inaugural loss of Book 3, even if it wasn't entirely fair.
I need to redeem myself. I need my honor back.
This is another Book 3 episode that I'm not too crazy about. Anyway, Aang goes through a hard time with his paranoia over the upcoming invasion, but Katara and the others eventually get him to go to sleep, which somehow fixes everything in the end. Like I said, I hate this episode, but this is another mental win for Aang. Although the invasion starts off full of hope and optimism, with Aang sneaking a kiss on Katara and Sokka finally getting to be the warrior he always wanted to be, somehow it never came up in conversation with the Earth King that Azula knew about the invasion, so the gang and all of their friends are lured into a trap, foiling the invasion, splitting up families, and getting all of the adults imprisoned. This is another colossal loss for Aang.
I need to redeem myself. I need my honor back.
This episode is a strange case for Aang, as he starts it off lackadaisical about his recent defeat, but the episode doesn't really have time to deal with any of that because, you know, the Zuko stuff. Also, it was technically solely Sokka who defeated Combustion Man with his boomerang, as none of the benders could get a decent angle. So although I've counted group victories in the past, I won't count this one for Aang since he technically doesn't contribute at all to Combustion Man's defeat. Aang and Zuko achieved their goals of meeting the Masters, with them both being judged worthy. They also both learn the true nature of firebending, so this is another mental win. This episode actually made me get a little nuanced in what I ultimately decided to assign to Aang. Aang gives Katara some really good advice for what to do when she faces the man who killed her mother, and he makes sure to lecture Katara on the cycle of revenge and how it ultimately destroys all parties involved. I believe that his words did have an impact on Katara's decision in the end, which would be emblematic of an Aang victory, but Katara does explicitly state that she never forgave her mother's killer, so ultimately I'm gonna give Aang a mental draw here.
Wake up, sleepyhead.
Although again, there is no real fight in this episode as well, Aang and the gang are all very disturbed by this play covering their journey, and they all take it way more personally than they probably should. From Aang questioning his relationship with Katara, and ultimately being shut down when he tries to kiss her again, to Aang's visible fear when he sees the play's depiction of the finale. I'm considering this entire episode a mental loss for Aang and the gang.
I need to redeem myself. I need my honor back.
This is probably going to be the most begrudgingly assigned win in the series. As much as I will die on the hill of Aang did the right thing, at least as a character and as a hero, by sparing Ozai's life, I've got to admit that I absolutely hate the path he takes to get there. Or perhaps the word path is a misnomer, as the only reason Aang gets to defeat Ozai in his own way is because Alliance Hurdle said so. Aang never had to work or find a solution to his problems, as the solution quite literally just came to him. Besides that terrible writing, during Aang's fight with Ozai, if he didn't have his morals, he could have defeated him earlier by either redirecting his lightning or choosing not to fight the Avatar state. But he chose to take away Ozai's bending, which did do the trick, so even though I'm very unhappy about it, Aang gets the win here. He defeated the Fire Lord, saved the world, and got the girl in the end. According to my rules, there were a total of only 12 fights, a series low. Of the 12 fights, Aang won 6 of them, lost 3 of them, and had 3 draws, giving him a win percentage of 50% and a loss and draw percentage of both 25%. Of course, I'll be filtering out mental wins, losses, and draws for those who don't count them, with Aang winning 2, losing 2, and drawing 2, giving him an equal 33% streak across all categories. With that being stated, I will be presenting a final data analysis of all of Aang's fights across all 3 books of Avatar. There were a total of 61 fights for Aang, with him winning 35 times, losing 18 times, and drawing 8 times, giving him a total win rate of approximately 57%, losing rate of approximately 30%, and a draw rate of approximately 13% for the series. If you remove all the mental stuff and account for only physical fights, you have a win rate of roughly 54%, a loss rate of roughly 27%, and a draw rate of roughly 19%. Okay, so we're actually starting this video off with a bona fide win for the Angry Prince. The only thing Zuko wants to do when he pulls up to the Southern Water Tribe is capture the Avatar. Aang lands him ass up for threatening innocent people, and the fight Aang and him have is inconclusive. But but Aang agrees to leave with Zuko if he stops endangering the village, effectively ceding the win to Zuko.
I won.
Just give me 10 minutes.
However, Aang quickly snatches that W out from under Zuko by uncapturing himself, whooping Zuko's ass with a mattress, and laying the smackdown with the Avatar state.
A few minutes later.
Sit your ass down. You ain't about to do nothing. Jumping up like you Mr. Get Bad. Where the fuck was you when he was beating my ass with that tree?
The prince was catching all kinds of zingers from Admiral Zhao in this episode, and it's too bad I don't count these on this list.
You're just a banished prince. Your own father doesn't even want you. It's a shame your father won't be here to watch me humiliate you. I guess your uncle will do.
Anyways, a middle-aged man really challenged a teenager to a fight in this episode, and Zuko was definitely having flashbacks to the last time that happened. Iroh, you're really not helping out right now.
Have you forgotten what happened last time you dueled the master?
I will never forget.
We start the fight with Zuko on the back foot, and just look at Zhao's face right now. This man is really thirsty to maim a minor.
Oh no, not again.
Come here! Zuko's life flashes before his eyes real quick, and Uncle Iroh comes in clutch.
Break his roots!
Zuko busts out his Olympic-class breakdancing moves and breaks Zhao's ankles, giving him the upper hand and winning him the fight. Then he gives Zhao a mark, just like his dad, and we're out. Just kidding. The prince actually has a lot more honor than that, but Iroh did have to humble him a little bit at the end.
My nephew is more honorable than you. Thanks again for the tea. It was delicious.
Did you really mean that, Uncle?
Of course. I told you ginseng tea is my favorite.
It's about time we put some respect on the Kyoshi Warriors, because nobody ever talks about how good a fight they put up against Zuko and his goons. Anyway, the prince gets in another battle with his prepubescent nemesis, and this time, it left me wondering how he got back up in one piece. Seriously, what the fuck are people made of in the Avatar universe? To add insult to injury, Aang left Zuko and his men looking like this at the end. Truly another embarrassing defeat for the prince. Zuko is my favorite character in this entire show because he never stays losing. Him and Iroh have been outnumbered, but
you are clearly outmatched.
the Prince and the Dragon of the West piece up all the Earthbenders, so this is another Zuko win. Once again, Zuko's only goal is to capture the Avatar, and he fails spectacularly at it. Honestly, with all these heavy hits he keeps taking, I don't see how he can still walk straight.
Dude, are you okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. You beat me fair and square.
We can take you to the hospital.
No, I'm fine.
He fails to get Aang, but Zhao was on standby that whole time, ready to lock his ass up for trespassing in the Fire Nation, so I gotta count it as a win that Zuko didn't end up behind bars by the end of this episode. It's sad that these Aang losses keep piling up on the Prince, but to be fair, he's chasing the Avatar universe's version of the Flash, so it's really quite impressive that Zuko gets as close as he does. Aang and them get away, and at first Zuko isn't even mad. This man is straight cheesing at the pirate captain he was just fighting, until he realized his ship got jacked too. If it wasn't for the fact that his ultimate goal is to capture the Avatar, Zuko would be straight winning in this episode. Him and Aang defeat and murk dozens of soldiers after Zuko sneaks in and frees Aang from Zhao's creepy-ass BDSM prison cell. Zuko even fakes Zhao out at the end, which gets him and Aang out of the stronghold. Zhao had a good get back though, as he gets his archers to knock his ass out cold. Unfortunately for Zhao, Aang has the feet of Hermes, so he books it out of there with Zuko on his back. Zuko fails to capture Aang when he wakes up, which means I have to give him another loss, but he also gets a win for preventing Zhao's hating ass from capturing Aang instead. This is the best fight Zuko and Aang ever had. Don't agree, and we can start a war down in those comments. It's absolutely hands, flames, Bagua versus Kung Fu here, complete with explosions. You can feel the weight of Zuko's constant L's to Aang in the air, and in every fire blast he throws. Too bad Aang can bend air and water at this point. I mean, what was Zuko thinking anyway? It's a well, of course there would be water down there. And if there wasn't, you would have just killed Aang for sure, which is antithetical to your mission and your character. Them L's must have knocked a few screws loose in the prince's head. Aang knocks his ass on the ground, and that's curtains. Absolute L for Zuko.
Back what?
I'm not gonna count Zuko surviving Zhao's setup as a win, but technically Zhao lost there because his objective was to kill Zuko, and he failed. Zuko versus Katara isn't the best fight for the prince, but to be fair, he's just trying to grab Aang and dip.
Yoink.
Katara is like hell nah though, and look at that face she's making. She's really enjoying getting payback on Zuko for like the dozen episodes where he with her and her friends. Unfortunately, the plot came knocking and the sun rises hella fast, so Zuko can grab that power up and drop this one line.
You rise with the moon. I rise with the sun.
Sadly, it isn't long before Katara returns to favor, and she was right.
It's not gonna be much of a match.
I would say this was embarrassing, but there was basically nothing he could have done better here. The prince was done though, and he was definitely about to serve justice to this homicidal hater right here. This fight is nearly completely one-sided, with Zhao getting absolutely destroyed by a kid young enough to be his own son.
This old ass man, this old is old enough to be my dad.
However, the ocean spirit was still absolutely livid that Zhao murked his better half earlier, and even though Zuko had the win in the bag, the spirit was about to finish the job. I'm still counting this as a Zuko win though, since he had Zhao on the ground, and it was clear he wasn't getting out of an ass beating either way. Sadly, the prince failed at his one job yet again, so I gotta give him one more L for not capturing the Avatar at the North Pole. And with that, let the season rest on the laurels of the prince's failures. Technically, Zuko is a loser this season, as he lost 8 times and won only 7 times. Most of his losses are him failing his ultimate objective, which is to capture Aang, and he never does that the entire season. So unfortunately, Azula was kind of right.
And he considers you a miserable failure for not finding the Avatar. I'm sorry it has to end this way, brother.
No, you're not.
Dad's going to kill you.
You're sick.
You're hurting my feelings. You will never rise from the ashes of your shame and humiliation. I am about to celebrate becoming an only child.
You think I'm a monster? No, I love you, Azula.
It was not by chance that Azula had been defeated. It was always clear that Azula was the greater combatant, the greater strategist, and the greater power. Azula had always been feared, and with that fear, she held the dreaded power to control anyone. But she'd met her match in the face of compassion. Her friends and family, Zuko, Mai, Ty Lee, and Ursa, had refused to fight Azula, leaving her open to her own insecurities. Dangerous, yet defenseless, Azula was left to decide her own fate. What was it Zuko said, she thinks? It's my turn now. Azula takes a moment to collect herself. She stands up, avoids Ursa's glare, and stares directly into Zuko's eyes. You managed to get quite the better of me years back, Zuzu. I did not deserve to be Fire Lord if I was too weak to defeat you. However, recently I have regained my composure and have defeated you the reigning Fire Lord and glorious Agni Kai. I know that I am not meant to be Fire Lord, but then again, the current Fire Lord remains too soft and too fragile. It's time we set the record straight once and for all. Zuko stares back at Azula dumbfounded. Before he can say anything, Ursa, May, and Ty Lee anxiously interject, pleading with Zuko to deny the request. "You're in no position to fight," says Ursa. Zuko looks at his mother, May, and Ty Lee for a second, and then turns his attention back to his sister. 2 weeks, he says solemnly. Zuko assigns royal guards to accompany Azula wherever she goes in the palace. She is not allowed to leave or to bend unless she is practicing under careful watch of May and Ty Lee. Azula graciously accepted Zuko's terms and takes this time to convalesce over the events of the prior days. Although she willingly agreed to Zuko's terms, she still finds the whole situation perplexing. How did he do this to me, she thinks. All of the others too. How could they defeat me without a single strike? "Azula, my love, are you alright?" calls Ursa from the next room. Ursa had been trying for days to talk with Azula, going as far as to move to the adjacent room where she knew Azula would be able to hear her, to feel her presence. Surprisingly, Azula had made some effort to talk with Zuko, and even May, but Ursa she would avoid. Ursa she shunned, out of fear of her conflicted feelings. "Azula, please, my child, know that I will always be here for you." Frustrated and on the brink of a breakdown, Azula requests an audience with Zuko. "Take me to see Father. I think I have some words for him alone." "Is it Mom?" asks Zuko. "I told her she should give you some space, but she clearly didn't listen." "That's enough about her, Zuzu. Take me to Father now." Zuko nods, dismisses the half-dozen guards stationed between Azula and himself, and leads her down the path to the royal prison. On the way, Azula asks Zuko, "So, when I've defeated you in Agni Kai, are you going to stick me in a place like this too? Or perhaps you'll take mercy on me and put me back in the crazy house?" Zuko stops walking, holds his fire torch closer to Azula's face, and replies, "I've gotten plenty of requests to do exactly that, or worse. All suggestions have been personally ignored." Zuko continues walking down the corridor, leaving Azula stupefied. Clearly, he has lost his mind, that Zuzu. "Right?" thinks Azula. "Hurry up," calls Zuko, his voice echoing back dozens of yards. Azula hurries to his position, joining him directly outside of Ozai's cell. Zuko looks over at Azula with a raised eyebrow. "Go ahead in," he says. "Won't you join me?" asks Azula, slyly. "I've said my piece to him in the past. Besides, he doesn't have much to say to the Fire Lord these days." Zuko gives a slight grin and walks back down the hall. Azula watches as he disappears around a dark corner, then turns her attention back to the door. Azula's feelings on Ozai are much less conflicted than that of her mother. He is nothing to her now, just a shell of his former self. However, there is one thing she desperately needs to know. One thing she knows he thoroughly understands. Azula opens the door slowly and takes a couple steps forward. "Azula," says Ozai in an aged, gravelly voice. Azula stares down at what remains of her father. His hair is all but snow white. His skin hangs loose, and there's no mistaking the tiredness in his voice. "How did you know it was I, Father?" "Your brother cares not for subtlety when he opens that door, nor do the guards. Of course, I've had no regal visits in quite some time. What brings you here? Has he imprisoned you as well?" "No. Yes. Maybe, I don't know," stammers Azula. "For what I've done, I ought to be thrown down here for the rats, just as you have. But that's just it. He hasn't done it. Why is that?" Ozai stares at Azula a moment, notices a tear staining her left cheek, her collar bent out of shape, the slight tremble in her limbs. Instantly, a smirk spreads across his lips. "You are weak," he says. "He doesn't imprison you because he no longer fears you." Azula wipes a tear away and replies, "You're right. His fear has been replaced by something foolish." Sympathy? Compassion? Madness? "But what of the others?" asks Azula. "My former friends don't fear me either. It's driving me crazy," she screams. "Azula, silence yourself," snaps Ozai. "Look at me. Despite your foolish weakness in the past, your brother has always been beneath you, beneath your cunning and your skill. He does not fear you, nor did the others, because they do not believe you to be the same Azula that I do. One born to be Fire Lord and succeed me, the Phoenix King." Ozai begins to cackle loudly, filling the cell with mad laughter. Azula stares back at her father, notices the bloodshot in his eyes, the familiar white coat wrapped around his torso, the musty reek of his cell. At once, she realizes the deception, how he has tried to manipulate her. Clearly, he has gone mad in this cell, lost all grip on reality, and descended into insanity. Azula gives a traditional bow and replies, "All hail the Phoenix King." Ozai continues to cackle, louder and louder than before, until he's retching on the floor. Azula slips out of the room slowly, making sure the iron door is shut tightly behind her. She bumps into Zuko halfway down the hall. "What happened?" Azula nervously replies, "I got what I wanted." Zuko stares at Azula perplexed. He's rarely seen her so bothered by anything. "Come on," says Zuko. "We have a play to catch." Zuko drops Azula off at her quarters with a single ticket. She takes it, examines it, but says nothing. Zuko only nods and leaves her alone. On the other side of the door, Ursa begins to call to Azula, but Zuko stops her and takes her on a walk throughout the palace. Azula lays slumped over her bed, staring blankly at the ticket. She hadn't noticed before, but the ticket reads, "Admittance 1, Love Amongst the Dragons." At first, Azula is angry, belligerently burning the ticket into ash. The play reminds her of her mother, whom she hates. Azula doesn't stop with the ticket though, as she begins to burn every painting of her mother or Ozai that she sees. By the end, her room is covered in gray dust and black ash. Guards storm into her room, hands and spears at the ready for an attack, but Zuko arrives shortly thereafter, dismissing them all. He walks up to Azula, coughing through the dust. She zaps the floor beneath him with lightning, sending him back a couple feet. Zuko rebounds, but doesn't firebend, only reaching a hand out to Azula. "Come on your feet. And no surprises this time. I'm still sore from last week." "Suits you right," says Azula, ignoring his gesture and regaining her feet. "Keep that wretched woman away from me, and I'll join you at the play." "Noted," says Zuko solemnly, and they both leave together. On the way to the theater, Azula notices that Zuko is uncharacteristically calm. "So, no big lectures about the evils of arson?" "Nah," says Zuko. "Aren't you gonna say anything?" Azula snaps. "About father? About me?" "Maybe," says Zuko. "Maybe it's time to accept that your little mind games don't work. At least not when I'm not afraid." Azula digs her nails into Zuko's back and shoves them as hard as she can. Zuko's arms crash into the earth, covering him in scrapes and bruises. Azula looks down at him in glee, expecting to see anger reflected back through Zuko's eyes, or maybe even a hint of fear. However, Zuko only stands, dusts himself off, and sighs. "You should save that for our rematch." Azula slumps forward a bit, a clear look of defeat spread across her face. "I'm more than a match for a weakling like you, Zuzu," she screams, nostrils flared in anger.
and I won't be accompanying you to another ridiculous play. Suit yourself, says Zuko, calmly walking off. Azula considers leaving the capital. Surely she can defeat all the guards and escape unscathed. Seconds before she's made her choice, she hears her mother's voice once again, calling out to her. She struggles to identify if she's imagined her mother's voice or if she is really closing in on her. Without looking for confirmation, she bolts down the path Zuko took to the Royal Theater. On the way, she looks around and notices that the entire capital is still deserted from their last skirmish. Every street corner, every building is devoid of life. She knows she's near Zuko in the theater when she hears sounds besides the tapping of her own boots. Once inside, Azula is transported back to her childhood as nostalgic memories of the Ember Island players flood her mind. At the top, in the nosebleed seats, sits Zuko. Azula is surprised to see a relatively full front row consisting of important advisors, royal guards, and a few notable business leaders. Azula makes her way up to Zuko, amidst some strong glares from the rest of the theater, including some of the actors. Yes, that's right, thinks Azula. Scared? You should be. She joins Zuko at the top, and he gives her a knowing look. It was Mom, wasn't it? You just know me so well, she says sarcastically. So, are you going to bore me with a non-butchered version of Love Amongst the Dragons? Zuko nods no and asks, haven't you given the cast a good look yet? Azula looks down at the play, examines the actors. The actor playing the Blue Spirit brazenly fumbles every other line. In the background, you can hear the director feeding him lines. Oh, says Azula shocked. You got the Ember Island players. Not just that, says Zuko. These are the same exact actors and director from all of those summers ago when we were kids. Azula can't help but to feel a pang of happiness. Despite the bad performance, Azula allows herself, if only for a few hours, to truly relax and enjoy her time with her brother. She falls asleep halfway through, and when she awakes, Zuko is helping her to her feet. How was the play? Says Azula with a yawn. The worst I've ever seen, says Zuko with a smile. The smile Azula had graciously adopted mere moments before transformed itself into a confused grimace. Zuko, chipper as ever, looked down at Azula in the dim moonlight. We've got to get Mother in on this. She would die of embarrassment. Azula continued to look down at the street. Not a word pursed her lips, and Zuko was beginning to worry. Azula, are you alright? Asked Zuko uneasily. Azula refused to answer. Her grimace hung lower and lower on her face. Her instincts were going haywire. She had enjoyed herself very much at the theater, seeing her father, the Fire Lord, for the weak and fragile man that he really was. She had allowed herself to be truly comfortable for the first time in many years. Too comfortable. A split second before Zuko could react, Azula unleashed a massive volley of lightning from her frantic fingertips. At the last second, Azula redirected the blast up into the sky, sparing Zuko. The blast illuminated the sky in a brilliant blue glow. While everyone was distracted, Azula bolted down the path out of the capital. Dozens of royal guards began to pursue her, but Zuko called for a ceasefire. However, some guards among his rank had begun to question his authority. It would seem that not all anti-Zuko sentiment had been stamped out, and Zuko's recent orders had seemed more and more unreasonable. As Azula was pursued up the mountain, Zuko found himself deadlocked in a fight against traitors. While dodging the flames of a half-dozen guards, Zuko lamented Azula's betrayal. This distraction provided one of the traitors a potentially fatal opening.
but he was thwarted by the arrival of Mei and Ty Lee. The combined might of Mei, Ty Lee, and a disoriented Zuko and a few other loyal guards proved enough to defeat the traitors, though some managed to escape. Zuko took a second to take in his surroundings and was horrified by what he saw. The theater he and Azula had so thoroughly enjoyed that evening was badly scorched near the entrance. Badly burned actors screamed in agony upon the ground. A single tear stained Zuko's scarred cheek. At his feet, a burning man reached up, his arms outstretched for aid. Mei took over command of the guards as Zuko extinguished the man and the theater. Once all the fires were dealt with, Zuko collapsed to the ground in exhaustion and shame. Mei attempted to comfort him, gently caressing his shoulder and asserting that everything would be okay. Zuko allowed Mei's warmth to overtake him as they assembled all the best physicians in the capital city. Meanwhile, up on the mountain crater, Azula continued to evade royal guards. However, Azula refused to fight back. She couldn't shake the guilt that had built up inside of her. She had truly felt happy for a couple fleeting moments, yet she'd thrown it all away out of confusion and instinct. Down the cliffside, Azula spotted a small alcove of rock, and feigning a direct attack, Azula managed to distract the guards long enough to slip within its recesses. This should buy me some time, thought Azula. The lead guard, a grizzled, hard-spoken man known as Commander Yamada, became frustrated. How could you allow her to escape? We had no choice, Commander, says a tall and slender guard named Officer Shu. She acted as if she were preparing to strike. Our Fire Lord will be most displeased by our failure. I'll likely be removed from command. My father, his father, and my great uncle before him have sworn to the Fire Lord to do their duty under penalty of death. I honor their memory and their will. No captures this time, men. If you should spot her, show her no mercy. But sir, counters Officer Shu. But nothing, Officer Shu. I am in charge here. Just then, the faint screech of a messenger hawk rang throughout the mountain. Great, mutters Commander Yamada in a bitter tone. The messenger hawk swooped down and landed gently upon Commander Yamada's wrist. Attached to his back was an embroidered message, clearly from the Fire Lord. Commander Yamada opened the message, but did not read aloud. A few moments later, the cliffside was consumed by a bright flash of light as the commander burnt the message to ash. Sir, if you don't mind me asking, starts Officer Shu, but Commander Yamada once again cuts him off. As I stated before, officers, no captures this time. Back in the capital palace, Zuko sat uncomfortably on his throne, awaiting the return of Commander Yamada. When he didn't hear back from Yamada or any of his other officers, he assumed the worst. Guards summoned Mei and Ty Lee to the throne room. A few moments later, Mei and Ty Lee were escorted into the royal throne room. Mei began to speak, but Zuko quickly cut her off with a wave of his hand. The royal city is in shambles, said Zuko, and my plan has ended in failure. I have a new task for you.